In Search of the Miraculous by P.D. Ouspensky, Chapter 1. That schools existed, I did not doubt, but at the same time, I became convinced that the schools I heard about and with which I could have come into contact were not for me. They were schools of either a frankly religious nature or a half-religious character, but definitely devotional in tone. These schools did not attract me, chiefly because if I had been seeking a religious way, I could have found it in Russia. Other schools were of slightly sentimental, moral, philosophical type, with a shade of asceticism, like the schools or the disciples of the followers of Ramakrishna. There were nice people connected with these schools, but I did not feel that they had real knowledge. Others, which are usually described as yogi schools, and which are based on the creation of trance states, had, in my eyes, something of the nature of spiritualism. I could not trust them. All their achievements were either self-deception or what the Orthodox mystics, in Russian monastic literature, called beauty or allurement. There was another type of school with which I was unable to make contact and of which I had only heard. These schools promised very much, but they also demanded very much. They demanded everything at once. It would have been necessary to stay in India and give up thoughts of returning to Europe, to renounce all my own ideas, aims, plans, and proceed along a road of which I could know nothing beforehand. These schools interested me very much, and the people who have been in touch with them and told me about them stood out distinctly from the common type. But still, it seemed to me that there ought to be schools of a more rational kind, and that a man had a right to look up to at a certain point, knowing where he was going. Simultaneously with this, I came to the conclusion that whatever name of the school, occult, esoteric, or yogi, they should exist on the ordinary earthly plane, like any other kind of school. A school of painting, a school of dancing, a school of medicine. I realized that thought of schools on another plane was simply a sign of weakness, of dreams taking place of real search. And I understood then that these dreams were one of the principal obstacles on our possible way to the miraculous. On the way to India, I made plans for further travels. This time I wanted to begin with the Mohammedan East, chiefly Russian Central Asia and Persia, but nothing of this was destined to materialize. From London through Norway, Sweden, and Finland, I arrived in Petersburg, already renamed Petrograd, and full of speculation and patriotism. Soon afterwards, I went to Moscow and began editorial work for the newspaper to which I had written from India. I stayed there about 6 weeks, but during that time a little episode occurred, which was connected with many things that happened later. One day, in the office of the newspaper, I found, while preparing for the next issue, a notice in, the Voice of Moscow, referring to the scenario of a ballet, The Struggle of the Magicians, which belonged, as it said, to a certain Hindu. The action of the ballet was to take place in India and give a complete picture of Oriental magic, including fakir miracles, sacred dances, and so on. I did not like the excessively jaunty tone of the paragraph, but as Hindu writers of ballet scenarios were, to a certain extent, rare in Moscow, I cut it out and put it into my paper, with the slight addition that there would be everything in the ballet that cannot be found in real India, but which travelers go there to see. Soon after this, for various reasons, I left the paper and went to Petersburg. There, in February and March 1915, I gave public lectures on my travels in India. The titles of these lectures were In Search of the Miraculous and The Problems of Death. In these lectures, which were to serve as an introduction to a book on my travels, it was my intention to write, a book on my travels that it was my intention to write. There you go. I said that in India the miraculous was not sought where it ought to be sought, that all ordinary ways were useless, and that India guarded her secrets better than many people supposed, but that the miraculous did exist there and was indicated by many things which people pass by without realizing their hidden sense and meaning, or without knowing how to approach them. I again had schools in mind. In spite of the war, my lectures evoked a considerable interest. There were more than 1,000 people at each in the Alexandrovsky Hall of the Petersburg Town Duma. I received many letters. People came to see me, and I felt on the basis of a search for the miraculous, it would be possible to unite together a very large number of people who were no longer able to swallow the customary forms of lying and living in lying. After Easter, I went to give these lectures in Moscow. Among people whom I had met during these lectures, there were two, one a musician, and the other a sculptor, who very soon began to speak to me about a group in Moscow which was engaged in various occult investigations and experiments and directed by a certain G, a Caucasian Greek, the very Hindu, so I understood, to whom belonged the ballet scenario mentioned in the newspaper I had come across 3 or 4 months before this. I must confess that what these two people told me about this group and what took place in it, all sorts of self-suggested wonders, interested me very little. I had heard tales of exactly like this many times before, and I had formed a definite opinion concerning them. Ladies who suddenly see eyes in their rooms which float in the air and fascinate them, and which they follow from street to street, and at the end arrive at the house of a certain Oriental to whom the eyes belong. Or people in the presence of the same Oriental suddenly feel he is looking right through them, seeing all their feelings, thoughts, and desires, and they have a strange sensation in their legs and cannot move, and then fall into his power to such an extent that he can make them do anything he desires, even from a distance. All this, and many other stories of the same sort, had always seemed to me to be simply bad fiction. People invent miracles for themselves and invent exactly what is expected from them. It is a mixture of superstition, self-suggestion, and defective thinking. And according to my observation, these stories never appear without a certain collaboration on the part of men to whom they refer. So that, in the light of previous experience, it was only after the persistent efforts of one of my new acquaintances, M, that I agreed to meet G and have a talk with him. My first meeting with him entirely changed my opinion of him and what I might expect from him. I remember this meeting very well. We arrived at a small cafe in a noisy, though not central street. I saw a man of an Oriental type, no longer young, with a black mustache and piercing eyes, who astonished me first of all because he seemed to be disguised and completely out of keeping with the place and its atmosphere. I was still full of impressions of the East, and this man, with the face of an Indian Raja or an Arab sheikh, whom I at once seemed to see in a white burnous or a gilded turban, seated here in this little cafe where small dealers and commission agents met together, in a black overcoat with a velvet collar and a black bowler hat produced a strange, unexpected, and almost alarming impression of a man poorly disguised, the sight of whom embarrasses you, because you see he is not what he pretends to be, and yet you have to speak and behave as though you did not see it. He spoke Russian incorrectly, with a strong Caucasian accent, and this accent, with which we are accustomed to associate anything apart from philosophical ideas, strengthens still further the strangeness and the unexpectedness of this impression. I do not remember how our talk began. I think we spoke of India, of esotericism, and of yogi schools. I gathered that G had traveled widely and been in places of which I had only heard, and which I very much wanted to visit. Not only did my questions not embarrass him, but it seemed to me that he put much more into each answer than I had asked for. I liked his manner of speaking, which was careful and precise. M soon left us. G told me of his work in Moscow. I did not fully understand him. It transpired from what he said that his work in his work, which was chiefly psychological in character, chemistry played a large part. Listening to him for the first time, I, of course, took his words literally. "What you say," I said, "reminds me of something I heard about a school in southern India. A Brahmin, an exceptional man in many respects, told a young Englishman in Travancore of a school which studied chemistry of the human body, and by means of introducing or removing various substances could change a man's moral and psychological nature. This is very much like what you were saying." "It may be so," said G, "but at the same time it may be quite different. There are schools which appear to make use of similar methods, but understand them quite differently. A similarity of methods, or even of ideas, proves nothing." "There is another question that interests me very much," I said. "There are substances which yogis take to induce certain states. Might these not be, in certain cases, narcotics?" I myself have carried out a number of experiments in this direction. Everything I've read about magic proves to me quite clearly that all schools, at all times, and in all countries, have made a very wide use of narcotics for the creation of those states which make magic possible. "Yes," said G, "in many cases these substances are those which you call narcotics, but they can be used in entirely different ways. There are schools which make use of narcotics in the right way. People in these schools take them for self-study, in order to take a look ahead, to know their responsibilities and possibilities better, to see beforehand, in advance, what can be attained later on as the result of prolonged work. When a man sees this and is convinced that what is going on, what he has learned theoretically, really exists, he then works consciously. He knows where he's going. Sometimes this is the easiest way of being convinced of the real experience of those possibilities which man often suspects in himself. There is a special chemistry relating to this. There are particular substances for each function. Each function can be either strengthened or weakened, awakened or put to sleep. But to do this, a great knowledge of the human machine and of its special chemistry is required. In all those schools which make use of this method, experiments are carried out only when they are really necessary, and only under the direction of experienced and competent men who can foresee all results and adopt measures against possible undesirable consequences. The substances used in these schools are not merely narcotics, as you call them, although many of them are prepared from such drugs as opium, hashish, and so on. Besides schools in which such experiments are carried out, these are other schools which use these are... Let me start the sentence over again. Okay. Besides schools in which such experiments are carried out, there are other schools which use these or similar substances, not for experiment or study, but to attain definite desired results, if only for a short time. Through a skillful use of such substances, a man can be made very clever or very strong for a certain time. Afterwards, of course, he dies or he goes mad, but this is not taken into consideration. Such schools also exist. So you see that we must speak very cautiously about schools. They may do practically the same things, but the results will be totally different. I was deeply interested in everything G said. I felt in it some new points of view, unlike any I had ever met before. He invited me to go with him to a house where some of his pupils were to foregather. We took a carriage and we went in the direction of Sokolniki. On the way, G told me how the war had interfered with many of his plans. Many of his pupils had gone with the first mobilization. Very expensive apparatus and instruments ordered from abroad had been lost. Then he spoke of the heavy expenditure connected with his work, of the expensive apartments he had taken, and to which I gathered we were going. He said further that his work interested a number of well-known people in Moscow, professors and artists, as he expressed it. But when I asked him who precisely they were, he did not give me a single name. I said, because I am a native of Moscow, and besides, I have worked on newspapers here for 10 years, so that I know more or less everybody. G said nothing to this. We came to a large empty flat over a municipal school, evidently belonging to the teachers of this school. I think it was the place in the former Red Pond, Pond. There were several of G's pupils in the flat, 3 or 4 young men and 2 ladies, both of whom looked like schoolmistresses. I had been in such flats before. Even the absence of furniture confirmed my idea, since municipal schoolmistresses were not given furniture. With this thought, it somehow became strange to look at G. Why had he told me that tale about enormous expenditure connected with his flat? In the first place, the flat was not his. In the second place, it was rent-free. And thirdly, it could not have cost more than £10 a month. There was something so singular in this obvious bluff that I thought at the time it must mean something. It is difficult for me to reconstruct the beginning of the conversation with G's pupils. Some of the things I heard surprised me. I tried to discover in what their work consisted, but they gave me no direct answers, insisting in some cases on a strange and to me unintelligible terminology. They suggested reading the beginning of a story written, so they had told me, by one of G's pupils who was not in Moscow at the time. Naturally, I agreed to do this, and one of them began to read aloud from the manuscript. The author described his meeting and acquaintance with G. My attention was attracted by the fact that the story began with the author coming across the same notice of the ballet, the struggle of the magicians, which I had myself seen in the Voice of Moscow in the winter. Further, this pleased me very much, because I expected it. At the first meeting, the author certainly felt that G put him, as it were, on the palm of his hand, weighed him, and put him back. The story was called Glimpses of Truth and was evidently written by a man without any literary experience. But, in spite of all this, it produced an impression, because it contained indications of a system in which I felt something very interesting, though I could neither name nor formulate it to myself, and some very strange and unexpected ideas about art which found in me a very strong response. I learned later that the author of the story was an imaginary person, and that the story had begun by two of G's pupils who were presently at the reading, and the object of giving an exposition of his ideas, with the object of giving an exposition of his ideas in a literary form. Still later, I heard that the idea of this story belonged to G himself. The reading of what constituted the first chapter stopped at this point. G listened attentively the whole time. He sat on the sofa with one leg tucked beneath him, drinking black coffee from a tumbler, smoking and sometimes glancing at me. I liked his movements, which had a great deal of a kind of feline grace and assurance. Even in his silence there was something which distinguished him from others. I felt that I would rather have met him not in Moscow, not in this flat, but in one of those places from which I had so recently returned, in the court of one of those Cairo mosques, in one of those ruined cities of Ceylon, or in one of those South Indian temples, Tanjore, Trichinopoli, or Madura. Well, how do you like the story? Asked G after a short silence when the reading had ended. I told him I found it interesting to listen to, but that, from my point of view, it had the defect of not making it clear exactly what it was about. The story spoke of a very strong impression produced upon the author by a doctrine he had met with, but it gave no adequate idea of the doctrine itself. Those who were present began to argue with me, pointing out that I had missed the important part of it. G himself said nothing. When I asked what was the system they were studying and what were its distinguishing features, I was answered very indefinitely. Then they spoke of the work on oneself, but in what this work consisted, they failed to explain. On the whole, the conversation with G's pupils did not go very well, and I felt something calculated and artificial in them, as though they were playing a part learned beforehand. Besides, the pupils did not match the teacher. They all belonged to that particular layer of Moscow rather poor intelligentsia, which I know very well, and from which I could not expect anything interesting. I even thought that it was strange to meet them on the way to the Miraculous. At the same time, they all seemed to me quite nice people, quite decent people. The stories I had heard from M obviously did not come from them, and did not refer to them. There is one thing I wanted to ask you, said G after a pause. Could this article be published in a paper? We thought we could acquaint the public in this way with our ideas. It is quite impossible, I said. This is not an article. That is, it's not anything having a beginning and an end. It is the beginning of a story, and it's too long for a newspaper. You see, we count material by lines. The reading occupied 2 hours. It is about 3,000 lines. You know what we call a feuilleton, in a paper. I'm going to spell this word for you because I certainly cannot pronounce it. Feuilleton, in a paper. An ordinary one is about 300 lines, so this part of the story will take 10 feuilletons. In Moscow papers, one of these with continuation is never printed more than once a week. So it will take 10 weeks, and it is a conversation of one night. It can be published. If it can be published, it is only in a monthly magazine. But I don't know if anyone's suitable for this. I don't know anyone suitable for this right now. And in this case, we'll have to ask for the whole story before they say anything. G did not say anything, and the conversation stopped at that. But in G himself, I at once felt something uncommon, and in the course of the evening this impression only strengthened. When I was taking my leave of him, the thought hashed into my mind that I must at once, without delay, arrange to meet him again, and that if I did not do so, I might lose all connection with him. I asked him if I could see him once more before my departure to Petersburg. He told me that he would be at the same cafe the following day at the same time. I came out with one of the young men. I felt myself very strange. A long reading which I little understood, people who did not answer my questions, G himself with his unusual manners and his influence on his people, which I all the time felt produced in me an unexpected desire to laugh, to shout, to sing, as though I had escaped from school or from some strange detention. I wanted to tell my impressions to this young man, make some jokes about G, and about the rather tedious and pretentious story. I at once imagined myself telling all this to some of my friends. Happily, I stopped myself in time. But he will go and telephone them at once. They are all friends. So I tried to keep myself in hand, and quite silently we came to the tram and rode towards the center of Moscow. After a rather long journey, we arrived at Okhotny Nad, Okhotnynad, near which place I stayed and silently said goodbye to one another and parted. I was at the same cafe where I had met G the next day, and the day following, and every day afterwards. During the week I spent in Moscow, I saw G every day. It very soon became clear to me that he knew very much of what I wanted to know. Among other things, he explained to me certain phenomena I had come across in India, which no one had been able to explain to me, either there on the spot or afterwards. In his explanations, I felt the assurance of a specialist, a very fine analysis of facts, and a system which I could not grasp, but the presence of which I already felt, because G's explanations made me think not only of the facts under discussion, but also of many other things I had observed or conjectured. And I'm going to pause here and continue next time. So, till soon.